Hi, and welcome to D Group. This is week number 7, and we are just now getting about halfway through our 14-week D Group commitment. And I hope you've had a great time together. I hope that you've had some great conversations. And so we're going to get started right away. This passage, we always ask the same 4 questions. And the first question is always, what does this passage say about God? You can't really take this passage out of context without remembering that they've just come through this stunning experience with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, where he was able to kind of validate everything the prophet said, what Elijah there, and everything the law was about with Moses there. And his disciples were hoping that it would just keep going, and immediately they go back down the valley. So what does this passage say about God? Well, last week we saw how God intends to share his glory. It's amazing that he does that, but he's doing something glorious and he wants us to be involved in it. And then, as soon as that happens, he shows his glory again by healing this man's son, but not without doubtful and arguing disciples. The 9 disciples that were remained were arguing with the scribes and the Pharisees there about what was happening with this boy who could not be healed. And you can see the frustration with Jesus. You know, the gospel is ground to a halt, and he's deliberately showing people what they need to see about going forward. And in Mark 9:19, he shows us the character and nature of God as someone who's long-suffering and patient, especially with doubting disciples. But ultimately, he reveals his glory again by healing the Father's Son. And didn't matter that the disciples didn't have any faith, didn't matter that they were doubting and arguing. What mattered is that he heard the Father's cry and the desperation. And there's another great few things going on here, but let's read the passage together. Mark 9:14 through 29. When they came to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and scribes disputing with them. All of a sudden, when the crowd saw him, they were amazed and ran to greet him. Then he asked them, "What are you arguing with them about?" Out of the crowd, one man answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams to the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they couldn't." He replied to them, "You unbelieving generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him to me." So they brought him to him. When the spirit saw him, it immediately convulsed the boy. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. "How long has it been happening to him?" Jesus asked the father. "From childhood," he said. "And many times it has thrown him into the fire or water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Then Jesus said to him, "If you can, everything is possible to the one who believes." Immediately, the father of the boy cried out, "I do believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly coming together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." Then it came out, shrieking and convulsing him violently. The boy became like a corpse, so that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus, taking him by the hand, raised him. He stood up and after went into a house. His disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he told them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." Very interesting passage. And we ask our second question, what does this passage say about the gospel? Well, we've seen how the gospel's been deliberately slowed down, a very cautious pace, so that we can understand exactly what Jesus is up to. And what we've just seen in the Mount of Transfiguration is just a manifest display of God's glory, but that God doesn't keep us on the mountain, that immediately we go back down to the valley where there's arguing and disputes and faithlessness and desperation, and Jesus' glory, it follows him to the valley. And again, like we said last week, that God is up to something glorious and he invites us to be a part of it. And this is just a perfect example of that. The glory of God and the gospel of God completely overlap. And they're not just revealed through the justification of sins when people are forgiven and get to go to heaven when they die, but also through the missional gospel living that occurs when you are involved with Jesus in the life of people who are in despair. And it's a victorious Christian life that really speaks most loudly about the gospel. In fact, Jesus said something I thought was amazing gospel bit of news and truth. In Mark 9:23, he said, "Everything is possible for him who believes." So he is telling us, Jesus' response shows us that God's love and grace it reaches everywhere. No one is outside the path, outside the reach of God's love and grace and power and gospel. That's the good news. And another couple of things that are interesting is that some interpreters suggest that when the boy seized, when Jesus asked this or demanded this demon to leave him, he seized, and people said he laid there like he was dead, and immediately Jesus raises him up. It's very reminiscent of the Jairus' daughter in Mark 5. And so it points to God's victory over sin and death. The gospel is won by Jesus, and this is the message of the good news. So perhaps the saddest part, the most helpful and saddest part of this passage is found in Mark 9:30 and 32, when Jesus predicted his death and resurrection a second time in front of the disciples, and again, the disciples didn't understand it. Well, that's why we spend so much time trying to clarify what the gospel is. Let's look at question number 3. What does this passage say about us? Well, when Peter and James and John returned from the mountaintop and found the remaining disciples engaged in an argument with the scribes, it shows us just how we also will face despair when we come off of our mountaintop experience. And there will be times in our gospel living that tasks seem way too large, and we're going to have to respond with prayer and focus. This healing had perplexed Jesus' disciples, and there was an argument over why they couldn't do it, and the scribes seized that opportunity, probably to mock them. We don't know exactly. But we're reminded that, and this is very important for us as Jesus' disciples, that there are things that we can do, nothing we can do that is apart from God and through his victory over sin and death in his son Jesus. So later Jesus expressed, and it was recorded in John 15:5, apart from me you can do nothing. So this passage really shows us just how important it is that we maintain our dependence on Jesus, and how our focus is not got to be on our own abilities and only going to him in prayer when we need him. No, we need him every day. That gospel living, one of God's greatest mission tools, is essential, and it's essential because of our dependence on Jesus. Well, the last question is, what specific action will I take because of any new insight that I've learned? Well, I'll tell you a few things that I'm learning. First of all, I need to understand that God has power to do great things, but this power only comes from God, not my own power. And I also need to understand that glory comes from both the mountaintop experience, like the Mounts of Transfiguration, but also just through humble service with desperate people in the valley, even arguing your point with doubting people. If you can stand firm in your faith and your explanation of the gospel, people will begin to believe you. Now, there was an argument here because there was a faithlessness, but there's where the glory of God can be shown too. Thirdly, I'm going to understand that there's a deeper glory and a deeper significance than I can see in this world, that something else is going on, and God is up to something. And if I stay obedient, and if I stay alert, and I keep looking, and I stay dependent upon him, I get to be a part of that. Well, finally, I'm going to commit myself to offering prayers. Prayers do things for me that nothing else can do. That's why Jesus said this kind only comes out through prayer. Prayer reminds me just how dependent I am upon God, just how dependent I am, because he's the only source for power and glory and for healing and for any miracle. And so if I'll keep that in mind, then I'll not be fearful or frustrated, then I'll not go back to the despair that this father demonstrated, that instead of saying, well, we don't know why we can't do this, that we would, instead of being doubtful, we would focus on prayer. Let's figure out, let's find out, let's request of God. What does he and what can he do in this situation? Well, there are a lot of things for you to discuss, and maybe tonight would be a good time to maybe stop your discussion early so that you can pray together. Be honest and transparent about some things that you can pray about. What are some things happening in your family? What are some things happening in your job or your neighborhood? Maybe in your own life. This is a very, very warm and intimate time, but it's a very, very crucial time too. So I would recommend that you not only pray and have the same person pray every week, but try some conversational prayer. Try some just some authentic transparency that will help you see that God's power and God's glory wants to be revealed. He's up to something wonderful, and we get to be a part of it. And prayer is one of those things that's going to help us get to be a part of it. Well, have a great discussion. We'll see you next week.